Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Paul Cowlins, a naturopathic physician and former professor of naturopathic medicine in Portland, Oregon. And welcome back to my series on salutogenic terrain medicine, where I explore novel paradigms in biology and medicine, including so-called natural medicines, in order to expand our understanding of the human being, health, and disease. If you like this content, please don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. And this is the 8th lecture in the series, and I'll be building upon what I've been speaking about in the previous lectures. I'll include a link to the last lecture below. So I've been arguing that our ways of knowing, reflected in the paradigms that we often unconsciously hold to be true, allow for the experience of different layers or dimensions of the universe around us, including the human being. And in this series of videos, I've been examining 4 particular modes of knowing based on an interpretation of the ancient Greek 4 elements of earth, water, air, and fire, that each represents a different mode of cognition. So far, I've discussed 2 of these modes of cognition and what they reveal about the human being, specifically the earth, the level of earth cognition, which reveals our solid, spatial, molecular configuration or organization, and that is the typical earth mode of knowing, is the typical mode of knowing that the current system of medicine, biomedicine, applies to both treatment, diagnosis and treatment of disease, as well as research. And I've been exploring a second mode of cognition, the water cognition, which is more fluid, relational, and imaginative. So one is speaking more in terms of qualities and relationships and polarities, not so much in terms of molecular quantitative entities. And I've been arguing that if we apply this mode of knowing, the fluid cognition, to the human being, that that we see that embedded within the physical organization, that physical organization is governed by the laws of physics and chemistry, molecular biology and biochemistry, that embedded within all of that is a higher, something working at a higher level, a sort of fluidic, liquid crystalline body that all of the molecules are dissolved in the body, and that when they're active in the life processes, they precipitate out of that liquid crystalline body when they precipitate into the physical, but that it's the liquid crystalline body that the level of life is working at. And that the laws governing that liquid crystal body, as I've been exploring, differ significantly from the laws of classical physics and chemistry. I've looked at how researchers and biophysicists such as Martin Chaplin and Gerald Pollack and Mei-Wan Ho and others have really opened up the beginning for a new line of research into the fluid organization, and how this is governed by, again, not classical laws, but likely quantum laws, especially laws related to what's called quantum coherence, as I've discussed, and the resonance transfer of information. For example, the frequency information of molecules can be transferred through the water nearly instantaneously and with near 100% efficiency. So it's very different than the classical pathways one learns in physiology of communication through the nervous system and the endocrine system, or even through the immune system with cytokines. So the water structures take on the form in our body of the so-called easy water. That was a term from Gerald Pollack, the exclusion zone water. And that this exclusion zone water has all sorts of anomalous properties, for example, being highly negentropic. It opposes the forces of disorder or entropy. And I'll get into that a little bit more, that when we talk about entropy, we're also talking about information. Higher ordered structures contain more information. This is different than semantic information like through language. It's more information about how to pattern or organize or structure something. That's the information I'm referring to. This easy water and the structured water really is able to store electrical charge, and this creates what's called charge separation in our tissues. For example, at the cell membrane, there is a so-called resting membrane potential. Each cell has its own unique voltage, and as I'll go into in this lecture and coming lectures, there's a lot of interesting research looking at how that membrane potential and the bioelectric fields that generates really is what guides morphogenesis or pattern formation in our tissues. That's a very important area. If we understood what actually creates the patterns in our tissues, what are the organizing forces that work there, then we can understand a lot more about how to treat certain diseases. we often assume that pattern information is just found in the genome, and the evidence is very clear it's not. The genome codes for proteins. Those proteins carry out different activities, and one current theory is that it's the physiochemical interactions of the proteins that eventually creates forms in tissues. But that's usually not enough to create, for example, the field or the organization of something like a face. You know, how is it, and this is a really key mystery in biology, how is it that, you know, we are replacing our matter? We estimate now roughly every 7 years we replace all the matter in our body, but our key structures and forms retain the same shape. We can still identify a person even years later, even though they contain completely different matter. All the molecules and atoms have been replaced, essentially. And yet they maintain this overarching form. That's still a great mystery of biology, and I'm going to start diving into that a little bit more here. These structured waters, the structured water in the body, the easy water, or what some of the Italian biophysicists I talked about discussed, they call these the coherent domains in water. All the water dipoles are vibrating in unison when they line up. They become extremely sensitive to the environment and can absorb energy and information, such as infrared light, as Gerald Pollack had talked about, and as well as more subtle information. And even thermal noise, the body can, these coherent domains in structured water, can absorb that thermal energy and organize it into high entropy light biophotons. So basically, or I'm sorry, low entropy biophotons. So it's very structured. So we can structure the energy that we absorb. Mei-Wan Ho went as far as to say that perhaps we're even tapping energy from the so-called quantum vacuum, the kind of random energy fluctuations that are constantly present in every point in space. Could it be that organisms are harvesting energy from there, which would suggest that we're not getting all of our energy from our foods and so forth. And it opens up a whole new discussion about nutrition, saying that really what we want to try to emphasize is the water coherence in our body, these coherent domains in structured water, which I'll get more into how we can do that. And then in being in those coherent states, we can absorb the necessary and the requisite energy, but also information, which I'm going to be talking about here is quite different. The coherent domains in water allow for that resonance transfer of information. So instead of the view that says that a molecule has to move spatially from one point to another for it to have an effect, let's say a medicine moving from the digestive tract through the blood to the cells, that's more of a physicalist pharmacologic model. That's our current model. If we look at the fluid body, we can say there's a second way that medicines, molecules can deliver information to the body, and that is through transferring their vibrational modes, their vibrational signatures, which we can see on spectroscopy. This is a well-known phenomena in organic chemistry, for example, and biochemistry. So they can transfer that information through the water, and that can have an effect in the cells. Now that's a interesting area that requires a lot more explanation, and there are some researchers that have looked at this. Could we mimic the vibrational frequencies of molecules through, for example, electromagnetic waves and transfer that information to the body, and could we have effects? And the answer is, from some of the experiments, is yes, which then begins to open up this idea that maybe all the vitamins, minerals, herbs that we take, really it's the information, the vibrational frequency information that the body is using, the fluid body in particular, to structure itself and to organize itself. It's not so much the material molecular part that's of importance, and that's very different than the current models that we're currently teaching. So this really opens up a whole new dimension when we talk about the body, the human body. We often are referring to the physical level, but here we're saying with the fluid level, whole new interactions can occur. This touches upon an area too, which I haven't talked about yet because it is very controversial, and that is the idea of the memory of water. And especially water, highly organized in biological tissues, can contain memory of molecules, for example, or maybe even psychological states, memories in our muscle. Muscle is mostly water, and in our tissues. And so essentially we're holding memory not just in the brain and neural structures, but we can hold memory throughout the whole body. And that techniques, massage and whatnot, stretching, movement exercises can release those memories, whether they be good or bad, traumatic or good memories, and this can have sort of a purging effect. So the water is actually the storage device, the hard drive essentially, made of water, that's storing memory on all these different levels. The memory of water is, again, a very controversial subject in physics and chemistry. There's been lots of back and forth debate about this for at least the last 20, 30 years, and that would deserve a whole nother lecture to talk about. And if anyone's interested, please put that in the comments below. And this is, of course, much discussed in the field of homeopathy. How we can dilute a substance, extract its vibrational frequency signatures into the water, and we can deliver that as to the fluid body as a remedial thing. And so that opens up a whole new possibility for, again, pharmacology. Now, this coherence in water I've talked about more locally within the cell, for example. We know cells the water in them is all coherent. It's all vibrating in a very similar fashion, holding information in that way. And then the biomolecules are extracting energy, putting energy into the water back and forth, so there's an exchange. And again, in most biochemistry books, we get rid of the water and we just look at the actual molecules bouncing one into another. But without the water, things like proteins couldn't fold, enzymes couldn't do the things that they do, and so forth. And water gives advantages, depending on the structures there, to the underlying biochemistry, sort of guides the biochemistry. So that's how we can see maybe the physical element as precipitating in a way from the fluid element. There's all these forces in the fluid which then are essentially carried through and into the different molecules that we are currently studying. So that's cellular coherence, but does the coherence extend beyond the cell into, for example, an entire organ being coherent, and then beyond the organ into the whole body, which would open up the idea of a field, every organ having its own field. All the cells are vibrating in unison, their biochemistry is synchronized in different rhythms, and that is a condition for health. That is where I think the research will be going. There's not a lot of evidence for that yet because that's very difficult to study. But we do know that these so-called quantum coherence effects can extend across relatively large distances. Again, we think maybe more at the protein or even cellular level, but perhaps even tissue and organ level, that all of the cells within an organ are vibrating in unison through the water structures. And that when they stop vibrating in unison, or the water becomes disorganized, it becomes more like bulk water or regular water within the cells, then we have disease. Maybe first we feel fatigue, and then over time, that's when illness processes set in. So that's an interesting other interpretation of how we store energy and the relationship between more functional disorders. We can say functional disorders are more problems that start in the water body first, and then when they move into the physical body, that's when we start to, our current methods in medicine can pick them up. We can start detecting that. But a lot of people feel they have a sense, an inner life sense for the fluid body. And this opens up an interesting question. Do we just have 5 senses or more? Going back to the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner, he argued we have 12. We have 12 senses, and one of them is what he called the life sense, and that is essentially that sense that I'm just not feeling well today. Pain is an extreme polarity on that. So if you take that I'm not feeling well and take it all the way further, we have pain. So essentially the kind of discomfort we get, we wake up in the morning, we're just feeling a little bit off. That is the life sense, which is detecting the activity in the fluid body. There's evidence I haven't discussed about the fluid body that there are actually channels of organized water throughout the body, and this is now being called the Primo vascular system. It was discovered many years ago by a Korean histologist, and it was named after him. It was first called the Bongan ducts after the researcher, but now it takes the name of Primo vascular system. It's extremely difficult to study because you need a living organism. You can't kill it and you can't preserve it in the usual ways like we do in gross anatomy and histology. So you have to look at living tissue and stain it in certain ways and certain dyes that don't destroy the water structures, because many of the dyes that we usually use do. What's been discovered is that this Primo vascular system is like a primitive lymphatic system, extends through organs, throughout fascia, and it's highly aligned with blood vessels and with nerves. So every nerve has its own system of Primo vascular vessels traveling with it. And the water within these vessels is highly coherent, it's highly organized, it's structured, it's easy water. And it's filled with, easy water tends to exclude different things, but there is evidence that there's dissolved DNA and RNA and whatnot in there, as well as a lot of growth factors, growth hormones. And then the coherent water itself has been observed. There's some evidence, and I'll put an article below describing some of this, to carry light. So they're like light channels that go along the nerves and go along the blood vessels. So this is another potential communication system, which is carrying, through the structured water, light processes. And I'm going to say a lot more about that here today. I argued in the past lectures that the notion of vital forces and vital humors may very well be descriptions more from imaginative consciousness of these quantum-like processes occurring in that liquid crystalline body. So for example, the Chinese concept of meridians and the Ayurvedic concept of nadis might very well be the Bongan duct channels or the Primo vascular system channels, and the information that's being carried through them, and that's being picked up through non-quantitative ways of knowing. It's using more qualitative ways of knowing. I also argue that in the ancient Greek medical philosophy, they referred to the fluid body and this concept of the vis medicatrix naturae in the humors, and that they describe the water bodies having an intelligent self-regulating property, the so-called vis medicatrix, that's constantly striving to support health. And so this is the real foundation of salutogenic medicine. And so we can say that, the pathogenic cellular model really applies to the physical level of organization. Here, when we talk about the fluid organization, we have to talk about salutogenesis and everything I talked about in the previous lectures. And then finally, I gave the insights of the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner regarding the fluid organization, which he based on earlier traditions and his own inner research using these water, air, fire modes of cognition. And he referred to this as the etheric body. And unlike older versions of vital forces or the ether of 19th century physics, Steiner used this word very precisely to describe, what he called etheric fields, that these are life fields that originate from the cosmic periphery and work on a different geometry, so-called polar Euclidean geometry, not the usual geometries of what he called centric, or the physical fields we know about, like gravity and electricity and so forth, electromagnetism. So these peripheral fields are more like, quantum fields in a way. They extend throughout the universe, and life can tap into them through the water element. And essentially what defines something as living in his conception here is that it's able to link up to etheric fields. And that's an interesting thing to just ponder more, again, imaginatively. And if anyone has practiced certain exercises, like in Qigong, a Chinese sort of meditative art, you stand in certain postures, and at first, you feel heaviness, almost like gravity is really taking over. But then there's a certain point you reach where the body becomes buoyant, where everything is lighter now. And it's as if you've connected with a different system of forces that are working, again, through that fluid element. So and when you're in that state, you feel recharged and revitalized. So it's interesting to think about how when we get into connection with those etheric fields, which I'm just throwing out here hypothetically at the moment, we have to say a lot more about that this would help. This is really the experience of connecting with a life energizing process. And that's working through the water. And when you connect with those fields, they organize those water domains to increase charge storage and charge separation in your tissue. So you're getting more charged up, basically, in connection with those fields. So all this really puts into question, if this is true, the current teachings around molecular nutrition and medicine, to say that that's maybe one dimension of things on the earth level, but on the fluid level, there's a whole different system going on here, which traditional medicines have spoken about for millennia, but we have in our current system of thinking neglected, or we tend to marginalize. But basically it would say that, the molecules we ingest are also, in addition to their material aspect, conveying information, vibrational information through their bonding vibrations and their electron shells, and that it's that information that is important, and that depending on where the molecule comes from, it can receive different subtle information. So for example, in chemistry, vitamin C is something known as ascorbic acid. Ascorbic acid, according to current chemistry, no matter what its source, if it's ascorbic acid purified, it is vitamin C. But this opens up the possibility that ascorbic acid derived from glucose or fructose from corn syrup in China has a different subtle vibrational signature than the vitamin C derived from lemon or from some other organic source. And that these would have different physiologic effects on the body. And, I've worked with many patients who claim that they do feel a difference subtly with these different types of sources. And so again, chemically, we would analyze it and say it's just vitamin C, ascorbic acid, but there's more subtle information which our current chemical analyses are not capturing. I alluded to the fact that in the anthroposophical circles, inspired by Rudolf Steiner, there is this technique called sensitive crystallization, where you put a drop of your extract in a salt solution, usually copper chloride, and the crystals then, when that salt solution dries, take on unique patterns which weren't there if you just have a control salt solution before adding the extract. And that extract can be very highly diluted, so it's not like it's overwhelming the crystals and causing physical changes. So there's some subtle information that's guiding the crystallization, almost like putting iron filings on a piece of paper over a magnet. It aligns in a field. Well, that happens too with these sensitive crystallizations. And so this was a technique Steiner argued could detect, or at least qualitatively visualize, some of these subtle etheric forces working through matter. So the overarching hypothesis here is we have a liquid crystalline body governed by its own quantum laws, different from the laws of physics and chemistry, connected with our life activities. And that illness, and the salutogenesis really is all about supporting the coherence, the quantum coherence in our cells, our tissues, and our organs. And that anything that would disturb that coherence, whether external environmental things like a toxin or a microbe or radiation, or internal factors, which are more subtle, psychological states, activities in the nervous system could change the water structures and could potentially lead to more of an illness process. So that's kind of so far what we've come to in our lectures here. I want to go further today and introduce some new ideas. If we want to, really look at the fluid organization, the plant world is a beautiful place to see that. The plants take the minerals in a more highly disorganized state, and they organize them into complex structures through the water body. So, and that's, of course, an interaction with light and then with the water externally and with minerals in the ground. But when we jump to the animal realm, which of course isn't an immediate transition, but if we transition from plants to animals through the invertebrates up to the vertebrates, you see entirely new phenomena coming in here. And I want to focus a little bit on that, because what you find is that there's something else in addition to the watery forces at work here. Instead of just life, when you jump to animals, there's some other, in human beings, there's another factor at work here. So for one, if we just observe animals, and again, this is not trying to explain anything, this is just making observations. They have different body plans. So of course, if you go to the vertebrates, we start to see cartilage and a skeletal system, a system of muscles, and then an actual nervous system with neurons, nerve cells. Now, plants have, we now know in their roots, a type of nervous system that works through the roots and through soil mycorrhiza, which are a type of fungi. And so a forest floor is like a vast nerve network. Beautiful how these plants communicate, but they don't actually have actual nerve cells, neurons, like animals do. So that's the distinction I'm making here. And then animals have actual organs, a liver, a kidney, a heart, lungs, and so forth. Again, going all the way up to the vertebrates and the higher animals. The German poet Goethe argued that plants also have organs, but the organ is just one organ, that's the leaf. And it's interesting if you study botany to realize that every plant structure is actually a modified leaf. From the leaf itself to thorns to the blossoms, all of those are just leaves that are contracted or expanded in various shapes. So plants have one organ, whereas animals have multiple. Another key difference we see is in animals, in embryology. In plants, they just start as a ball of cells and grow outward into the primordial leaves and the rootlets and whatnot. So it's just growth that happens there. Whereas in animals, something different happens. You have the fertilized egg, the so-called zygote in the human being. The egg and sperm come together, they form the zygote. And then that grows into a little ball of cells called the morula. Looks like a little grape. And then that hollows out and forms what's called a blastula. But then in the animal world, in the human world, something interesting happens. A little divot of cells on the outside of the blastula or the blastocyst starts to move inward. It's almost like having a balloon, you put a finger on it and push in. Some other force is starting to work in here, and it creates an inner space with layers of tissue which will differentiate into all the different inner structures, the organs, the tissues of the developed animal and the human being. So that is the process of gastrulation. Gastrula means little stomach, so it's like forming an inner pouch or little stomach. It's as if, the image is as if something standing outside the blastula has now internalized, and it's creating inner pockets. And as this structure evolves, it develops certain shapes inwardly, which then get dissolved, they reshape. This doesn't happen in plants. Plants just build one leaf upon the other, eventually in the perennial, culminating in the flower and the seeds and so forth. But in animals, there's this constant inner restructuring going on here in an internal space. And eventually, this internal space will have all the organs, the musculoskeletal system, a nervous system. It will be enclosed by a skin. Again, we see that more and more advancing as we go up the so-called ladder of evolution. So that is a interesting image of creating this inner space. You can see that if you just look at a leaf surrounded by air and light. Contrast that with what's called the alveolus, which is the little air sac in the lungs, at the end of the lungs. The air sacs kind of look like little grapes, but maybe leaves in a way, and they contain the air on the inside, and all the forces and activities in air on the inside, which then radiate into the organism, versus in the animal, or in the plant, all those stand on the outside. So there's an inversion that sort of happens in the animal world from the plant world. Very interesting observation. Now, some plants do create inner pockets. They create inner spaces. But what's curious about those plants, for example, nightshades or plants in the orchid families, they almost look like, the flowers look like reproductive organs. They look like organs, almost like animal-like organs. If you make extracts of these, you find that they contain molecules called alkaloids. And alkaloids contain, they're molecules that contain nitrogen. And we can think of nitrogen as the primary element in air. Air is 80%, the atmosphere is 80%, and molecular nitrogen, N2, and only 20% or so oxygen. But that nitrogen element, we can think again using imaginative cognition, has internalized in these particular plants and the nightshades and whatnot, creating alkaloids, which interestingly all have animal-like effects within us. If we take them, they affect our consciousness, our nervous systems, like caffeine and atropine and these different things. So it's curious that in the plants, there's almost like some of these plants families are merging close to an animal-like existence and have internalized these outer forces. Another thing we see in animals different from plants is movement. Now, plants move, they follow the sun, for example, in sunflowers, but they move by growing by cells in the neck of the sunflower, filling with water, swelling, and then growing. So it's really a modification of growth. So movement in plants is more of a growth activity versus, and then when they move another way, the cells shrink or they die off. So it's a very slow movement. Versus in animals, there's now muscles, musculoskeletal system, and nerves, and the movement is much quicker, it's more externalized in this way. And animals have all these capacities, so each animal, depending on its specialty, can crawl, run, swim, jump, even fly. So there's a whole range of activities now that a plant can't do that we see coming out in the animal kingdom. There's a connection here. Also, interestingly, if we look at plants, they grow vertically to gravity, so roots down, blossoms up. Whereas if we start looking at the animal kingdom, especially moving up again towards the vertebrates, we now see a horizontal gesture. The spine is horizontal to gravity, which is a different relationship to gravity and creates new capacities. So again, these are qualitative differences which we tend to just ignore, but if we think about them, they actually have deep significance. There's also, in animals, internalized breathing now, starting with the amphibians going up into the vertebrates. The breathing rhythm, these breathing rhythms really are connected actually with the movement of the animal. So if we look at the crawling gestures, walking, that's sort of an externalized breathing rhythm. So there's this now internalized air element that's coming out. Whereas in the plants, the air element the air activity stand more on the outside. There's also in animals now sound. So from the croaking of frogs all the way up to bird song, there's an expression of more of what we might call an internal world that's coming out. So that gives you the impression that the animal has an internal world, where that internal world is not the same with a plant. It's almost like their internal world is more the outer world, whereas animals as if internalize that outer world. So creating an inner space. And now in that inner space, there are things like sensations, instincts, desires, like, dislike, feelings. There is an element which historically has been referred to as the soul. Now, again, that's in the modern earth cognition. They get rid of soul. They say it's all product of your neurons somehow. We don't really know how that happens, but that's the assumption. But if we just stick with the phenomena we just described, yeah, there's like an inner pocket of inner activity that's going on in animals, very different than we see typically in plants. And this element is connected with feelings, feeling life. If we look at feelings, really there are two states of feelings. There is, we can say the extreme is sympathy, liking, and then antipathy, disliking. And all of our feelings are on that spectrum. We either like it, and the ultimate like is love, and then dislike, hate, would be that kind of polarity. But all the feelings come in there. These are described more through a different language here. This is more that inspirative feeling cognition I'm referring to. And I'm using my hands a lot here because this is really a language of gesture. So each feeling has a certain gesture, which if you really study animals, it's as if their outer motions are externalized feeling states. I know that's a little bit of an interesting observation. You have to really think about that and make some observations. But it's as if each animal in its actual body plan, but also its motions, is sort of a walking feeling state. And each animal then has different types of feeling states. So that's something I'll just throw out there as maybe something to ponder. Again, historically, this inner space of activity that can create outer movement has been referred to as soul or psyche. And it's really the basis of consciousness, what we would call consciousness or mind today. So in the animal realm, we're seeing sort of a consciousness activity coming out, which is different than plants. Now, do plants have a consciousness activity and whatnot? I won't go into that discussion in depth here, but I'll say an interesting observation is that in plants, that air activity, which is organized internally in the animal and related here to consciousness, through the breathing process and movement and whatnot, stands outside the plant, and we see the wind, the sun, the lunar rhythms, we see the insect world. And so it's interesting to think about how what has become internalized in the animal stands external to the plant in the wind, in the air, in the insects. And that is the soul world of the plant is outside. So plants do have a soul, but they're not individualized in the same way that an animal would have, based on this way of thinking. So this air organization really is, we bring inward in animals and human beings, and it has, it's connected here with our inner psyche, our inner world of feeling, sensation, instincts, desires, and so forth. And it has its own inner laws, its own inner organization. We can say there are psychic laws, in addition, different than life laws and physical laws, psychic principles. And we can really experience this in dreaming. In dreaming, you're not bound by gravity. You can just set your intention to go somewhere if you remain conscious somewhat while dreaming, and you're there. So the laws of the psychic realm, if we take that as a reality, are very different than the laws that govern life and that govern the physical mineral processes. Now, here I just want to touch upon, without making this too long in this particular video, some of the insights going back to Rudolf Steiner about this inner air organization. He argued that we do have this inner air organization, and he called this, based on earlier traditions, the so-called astral body. An astral body, astra after stars, star body, he argued animals and human beings internalize, versus plants they keep that on the exterior. So the star body and the forces from the sun and the moon and so forth work externally on the plant, versus they are internalized in animals and the human being. So it's again using more imaginative and inspirative cognition here. We can see that if we study animals closely, it's as if they starting with the invertebrates, moving upward, they're internalizing more and more what are external processes in the plant. So one example would be reproduction. So plants, of course, reproduce externally. If we look at things like go to a coral reef at the full moon, all the coral, these invertebrates will eject sperm, and then the sperm are in the water, and then eggs are fertilized that way. So the reproduction is external to the invertebrate. But if we move up the animal kingdom to more and more complexity, we see that reproduction starts to, goes into the form of eggs. And then eventually, when we get to mammals, we start to see internal reproduction. So the reproductive force is a womb, a uterus. So now the reproductive forces are brought inward. And what's curious is that, if we go back to that coral reef, the full moon, every full moon, this cycle occurs. You see the sperm released into the water. Same thing happens in the human being. There is a 24-hour lunar cycle that governs the reproductive cycle. Now, one doesn't have to necessarily be synced with that cycle, but it still remains roughly 29 days or so. So basically, the image here is that in higher mammals and human beings, we have internalized the reproductive rhythm, which stands external to plants and to lower invertebrates. Another example would be warm-bloodedness. So up until birds, essentially, we have cold-blooded animals. But then in the mammals and the birds, we now start to see warm-bloodedness, as if the forces externally that just work on a plant, and then the cold-blooded animals, they have to depend on the external environment for their warmth. We can now maintain as mammals internal heat. There's an internal system of heat regulation and whatnot that has come internalized. So this is the image Steiner was alluding to, that animals have gradually interiorized what are exterior forces in the plant world. And so now we have all these inner rhythms, which interestingly are synchronized with outer things like the solar rhythm, the 24-hour day rhythm, and the lunar rhythm, and perhaps even more subtle planetary rhythms, which I won't discuss here, but just as a hint, there will be something coming up here with that. Steiner described this astral body essentially as, carrying all of those rhythms and that external information into the body. And if one uses this more higher cognition that he described, that one sees a type of inner light body, that the experience is as if the light in the atmosphere has now become internalized and is organized highly. He described, for example, around how nerves, one sees a lot of light activities, which I will come back to more from the scientific sense and what we now know about how biophotons, inner light, is conducted to the body. As a hint, it's connected with nerves. So basically, we can argue that perhaps he was describing ways of seeing that inner light body through these higher senses. Steiner wasn't the first to use this term, astral body. This was a very ancient term, but he gave some interesting descriptions of it. And again, this is taken more from water, air, and fire cognition, very different than earth cognition. But I think it can open up our understanding and help us form hypotheses, which we can then test through the earth cognition. And so what I want to do in the next video is really describe Steiner's description of the so-called astral body and its effects with the etheric. It is, again, he described this as a separate level of organization above the etheric, which in animals and humans ultimately will shape the etheric into the forms that we see in animals and in humans as well. And so this, we can think of the astral body as helping to guide morphogenesis, and there'll be a lot to say about that. Again, morphogenesis is laying down of biological body plans and patterns. So that will be what I want to jump into the next lecture. So this is an introduction to that. So as always, thank you for listening, and if you like the content, feel free to share, like, and subscribe. And I would appreciate comments if there are other topics people want me to talk about, or if there are any questions or things that weren't clear through all this, feel free to leave those in the comments below so that others can also share in that. All right, well, that'll end it for this one, and thank you for listening.